The year was 2387, and humans had spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. On the frontier world of New Arizona, a desert planet that looked like the old American Southwest back on Earth, stories moved faster than spaceships between towns. The most whispered story was about Ayanna, the woman they called the Apache Queen who ruled the red desert beyond where the colonists dared to go. Jake Morrison had heard these stories in every bar from New Phoenix to Copper Ridge. People said she led warriors who rode metal horses that could jump over canyons and climb straight up cliff walls. They said her people mixed old Apache ways from Earth with new technology to survive on this hard world. Most important of all, they said nobody who went into her land ever came back alive. Especially not the pale colonists who reminded her people of the enemies from old Earth. But Jake Morrison was not like most colonists. He was born on the frontier, and raised by a mixed family that had both Earth humans and people who had changed to fit this new world. He walked with the easy confidence of a man who knew that respect had to be earned, not taken. His face showed 20 years under alien suns, and his hands knew how to use both laser guns and old revolvers. When the rich rancher Carlos Bennett offered 10,000 credits to anyone who could make friends with Ayanna's tribe for trading, most people laughed. When Jake stepped up to take the job, the laughing stopped. Everyone knew Jake Morrison had a way with people, but this seemed like fancy suicide. Jake got his hoverbike ready and packed his gear while he studied everything. People knew about the Apache Queen. They said Ayanna was smart, beautiful, and completely without mercy. She had brought scattered tribes together across the desert by being a great war leader and respecting the old ways. Her people had done well where others failed, making the harsh planet their home instead of trying to change it into something they knew. The stories about her were wild and probably half lies, but Jake had learned to find truth in the middle of frontier tales. What seemed real was that Ayanna had built something special out in the Red Waste. Her people were not just alive, but thriving in a place that killed most others who tried to settle there. Jake spent his last night in town at Murphy's Saloon, listening to every story about the Apache Queen that drunk miners and failed prospectors wanted to tell. Some said she could make the desert itself fight for her. Others claimed she had magic that let her see the future. A few swore she was not fully human anymore, changed by alien technology into something new and dangerous. The one thing everyone agreed on was that her people hated outsiders, especially the kind who came looking to take what was not theirs. The Apache had long memories that reached back to old Earth, where their ancestors had fought and lost against people who looked just like the current colonists. Old Pete, who claimed he had seen one of her warriors from a distance, described weapons that seemed alive and armor that shifted like liquid metal. He talked about how they moved across the desert like they were part of it, reading signs in the sand and rocks that no colonist could understand. Jake listened to it all and tried to separate what might be true from what was just fear-talking. He had spent enough time on the frontier to know that stories grew in the telling, especially when they were about people who scared the tellers. What Jake did believe was that Ayanna had found a way to make the desert work for her instead of against her. That took more than just weapons and fear. It took understanding and skill that most colonists never bothered to learn. The next morning, Jake rode out on his modified hoverbike. He had chosen something that could handle rough ground and sudden sandstorms but would not look like a threat. Most colonists used heavy machines that tried to force their way through the land. Jake wanted to show respect for the desert instead of trying to beat it into submission. He carried water for a week, food for longer, and trade goods that showed he understood something about Apache culture. No cheap trinkets or useless gadgets, but good knives, quality cloth, and small tech items that could be useful without being threatening. The desert was bigger and stranger than Jake had expected. Red sand stretched to the horizon, broken by crystal formations that caught the light of twin suns and threw it back in colors that had no names. Plants with metal leaves created shade that shimmered like water, and the air itself seemed to move, with purpose. Jake had been riding for 2 days when he started to feel watched. Nothing he could point to, just the feeling that eyes were tracking his movement across the empty land. He did not change his path or speed, but he made sure his weapons were easy to reach. On the 3rd day they found him. Jake never saw them coming. One moment he was checking his navigation system. The next he was surrounded by riders on machines that made no sense. They looked like metal horses but moved with liquid grace that spoke of technology beyond anything he knew. The riders wore a mix of old Apache clothes and modern armor, their faces painted with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the desert light. They did not speak standard galactic to him. Instead, they used rapid Apache, a language Jake had studied but never mastered. Still, their hand signals were clear enough. He was to come with them, and he was to come now. Jake raised his hands to show he was not reaching for weapons, and nodded, his agreement. This was what he had come for, even if it was happening faster than he had planned. The ride to their settlement took hours across ground that would have destroyed most vehicles. Jake's escorts moved with supernatural skill, guiding their metal mounts over obstacles that seemed impossible to cross. Jake found himself impressed despite the danger, watching how they worked with their machines and the land itself. When they finally reached the top of a rise and looked down into a hidden valley, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. The settlement below was like nothing he had ever seen, and he began to understand that the stories about the Apache Queen had not been wild enough. The settlement in the hidden valley looked like magic made real. Traditional Apache dwellings blended so smoothly with advanced technology that Jake could not tell where one ended and the other began. Solar collectors disguised as metal artwork powered the community while water systems worked invisibly to support life in the desert. It was a masterpiece of making the new world work with old wisdom. Jake's escorts led him down a winding path that seemed to be cut from the rock itself. As they got closer to the settlement, he could see more details that amazed him. Gardens grew in the desert sand, fed by water that came from somewhere deep underground. Children played with toys that floated in the air, while adults worked with tools that seemed to respond to thought as much as touch. The people who came out to watch them pass were not what Jake had expected from the stories. They looked healthy and confident, not like desperate fighters barely surviving in the waste. Women wore traditional dresses decorated with fiber optic threads that created patterns of light. Men carried weapons that combined old designs with new materials, creating tools that were both beautiful and deadly. Jake noticed that nobody seemed afraid of him, which was almost more unsettling than if they had been hostile. These people had confidence that came from strength, not the nervous energy of those who lived in constant fear. His escorts brought him to a large dwelling at the center of the settlement. It looked like a traditional wickiup from the outside, built with poles and covered material, but Jake could see the subtle signs of technology woven throughout the structure. Force field generators hidden in the support posts, communication arrays disguised as decorative elements, and climate control that kept the interior comfortable despite the desert heat. The guards gestured for him to dismount and wait. Jake climbed down from his hoverbike, trying to look calm while his mind raced with questions about what would happen next. He had made it this far, but the real test was just beginning. A woman emerged from the dwelling, and Jake knew immediately that this was Ayanna, the Apache Queen herself. She was younger than the story suggested, maybe 30 standard years, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. Her black hair was woven with fiber optic strands that created shifting patterns of light as she moved, and her clothing combined traditional Apache designs with modern materials that could probably stop a laser blast. She looked at Jake for a long moment without speaking, taking in every detail of his appearance and equipment. Her gaze was not hostile, but it was certainly measuring. Jake had the feeling that she was learning more about him in those few seconds than most people discovered, in hours of conversation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that made people listen without thinking about it. "You are Jake Morrison," she said in perfect standard galactic. It was not a question. "You are the one they call the Bridge Walker, who moves between worlds without losing himself to either." Jake nodded, surprised that she knew his reputation among the frontier peoples. "I am. And you are Ayanna, who they call the Apache Queen, though I suspect you have many names your enemies never learn." A small smile touched her lips, the first sign of warmth he had seen from her. "You show more wisdom than most of your kind. Tell me, Jake Morrison, why have you come to my territory? Do you seek glory, wealth, or are you simply another fool who believes he can conquer what he does not understand. Jake met her gaze without flinching, knowing that this moment would determine everything that followed. I came because my people need what your people have learned. You have thrived in this desert while our settlements struggle. I came hoping to learn, not to conquer. Ayana studied him for what felt like a very long time, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a new note of interest. Many have claimed to come in peace, Jake Morrison. All of them lied. What makes you different? Jake thought carefully before answering, knowing that his words would be weighed against everything she had experienced with his people. Maybe nothing makes me different. Maybe I will disappoint you like the others did. But I am willing to prove myself by your standards, not mine. I did not come here to judge your ways or change them. I came to learn if there is a path between our peoples that does not end in bloodshed. Ayana nodded slowly, and Jake had the sense that he had passed some kind of first test. We will see, Jake Morrison. We will see if you truly mean what you say. But first you must understand what you are asking to learn. She gestured for him to follow her into the dwelling. The interior was even more impressive than Jake had expected. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, thanks to clever use of technology that folded dimensions. Traditional Apache symbols were woven throughout the living area, but each one incorporated advanced systems that served practical purposes. Holographic displays showed weather patterns across the continent. Communication arrays connected to networks that spanned the planet, and environmental controls maintained perfect conditions inside, while the desert raged outside. It was a blend of old and new that spoke of deep understanding of both traditions. My people have spent 3 generations learning to live on this world, Ayana explained as she showed him around the space. We did not try to make it into old Earth. We learned to become part of what was already here. That required us to change in ways that your colonists refused to consider. Jake looked at the technology around him, beginning to understand that what he was seeing represented far more than just survival. This was adaptation at a level most humans never achieved. Your people have not just survived here. You have become something new. Yes, Ayana said simply. And that is why most of your people fear us. We represent a path they are not willing to take. They would rather try to force this world to become what they want instead of learning to become what this world needs. She led him to a section of the dwelling that served as both library and planning center. Maps of the continent covered the walls, but these were not simple geographical charts. They showed the movement of resources, the patterns of weather and wildlife, and the complex relationships that kept the desert ecosystem in balance. This is what we have learned, Ayana said, gesturing to the wealth of information around them. This is what we could teach your people, if they were willing to listen. But first you must prove that you can listen. You must show that you can learn to see this world through eyes that are not trying to conquer it. Jake realized that he was being offered something incredible, but also incredibly dangerous. The knowledge represented in this room could revolutionize how humans lived on frontier worlds. But gaining access to it would require him to change in ways he might not be able to predict or control. Ayana gestured for Jake to sit on what looked like simple woven mats, but he could feel the subtle hum of technology beneath the traditional materials. Force field generators provided protection, while maintaining the appearance of a simple dwelling. Everything about this place spoke of people who had learned to blend the old ways with new needs. Tell me about the stories your people tell, Ayana said, as she settled across from him. What do they say about the Apache queen and her savage warriors who kill anyone who enters their territory? Jake considered his words carefully, knowing that honesty was his only real option with someone this perceptive. They say you are brilliant and dangerous. They say your people have weapons and technology that make no sense to our scientists. They say no outsider who comes here ever returns to tell about it. And what do you believe? I believe your people have good reasons for everything they do, Jake replied. I believe the colonists who disappeared either came here with bad intentions or refused to respect your ways. I do not think you kill for pleasure, but I think you will do whatever is necessary to protect your people. Ayana nodded approvingly. You see more clearly than most. Yes, we have defended ourselves against those who came to take what was not theirs. Yes, we have weapons and knowledge that your people do not understand. But we are not the monsters your stories make us out to be. She stood and moved to one of the holographic displays, calling up images that showed the history of contact between her people and the colonists. Jake watched scenes of attempted negotiations that ended in violence, mining operations that destroyed, sacred sites and military patrols that shot first and asked questions never. Your people see this world as empty land waiting to be claimed, Ayana explained. They do not understand that we have been here for 3 generations, learning to become part of what already exists. They want to terraform this planet into a copy of old Earth. We have learned to become something that belongs here. The images shifted to show the transformation of Ayana's people over the decades. Jake saw how they had adapted their technology, their social structures, and even their biology to thrive in an environment that killed most other settlers. It was evolution in fast motion, guided by intelligence and necessity. This is why we cannot simply allow your people to expand into our territory, Ayana continued. They would destroy in months what we have spent generations building. Not from evil intent, but from ignorance and unwillingness to change their fundamental assumptions about how humans should live. Jake studied the displays, beginning to understand the depth of the conflict between the two groups. It was not just about territory or resources. It was about completely different philosophies of how humans should relate to alien worlds. What would it take for our peoples to coexist? Jake asked. Ayana turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the holographic light. Your people would have to accept that their way is not the only way. They would have to learn that adaptation is not surrender but wisdom. They would have to trust us enough to learn from us instead of trying to conquer us. And your people, what would they have to accept? That not all outsiders are enemies, Ayana admitted. That some of your people might be willing to change and grow. That the knowledge we have gained could be shared without being destroyed or misused. Jake felt the weight of the challenge she was describing. Both sides had good reasons for their distrust, built on generations of conflict and misunderstanding. But he also sensed that Ayana was testing him, looking for something that might make a difference. You brought me here for a reason, Jake said. You could have had your warriors kill me in the desert or send me back with a warning. Instead, you brought me to see all this. Why? Ayana was quiet for a long moment, and Jake had the sense that she was making a decision that could not be unmade. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of responsibility and hope. Because I believe that bridge walking is possible, even if it is dangerous. Because my scouts have watched you for years and reported that you treat all people with respect, regardless of their origin. Because we need someone who can speak to your people in a language they will understand. She moved to another section of the dwelling and activated a communication system that showed the movement of colonial forces across the continent. Jake could see military buildups near Apache territory, supply convoys heading toward strategic positions, and surveillance networks that were clearly preparing for some kind of major operation. Your military leaders have decided that we represent a threat that must be eliminated, Ayana explained. They are planning an offensive that will begin within weeks. If that happens, both our peoples will suffer losses that cannot be recovered. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the climate control systems. How do you know all this? We have sources among your people, Ayana said simply. Not spies or traitors, but individuals who believe that war is not the answer. They have been feeding us information in hopes that we might find another way. The scope of what she was telling him began to sink in. This was not just about trade relations or territorial disputes. This was about preventing a war that could destroy everything both sides had built on this world. What do you want from me? Jake asked. I want you to stay, Ayana said, her words carrying enormous weight. Not as a prisoner or a guest, but as someone who learns our ways from the inside. I want you to become a bridge between our peoples. Someone who can speak with authority about what we have accomplished and what we could accomplish together. Jake realized that she was asking him to abandon his old life, at least temporarily, to live among people who had every reason to distrust him, learning ways that challenged everything he thought he knew about survival and technology. What would Staying mean. Exactly. Ayana met his gaze without flinching. It would mean sharing my tent. It would mean becoming part of our tribe, learning our deepest secrets, and helping us decide whether your people can ever truly be our allies. It would mean risking your life on the chance that understanding is stronger than fear. Jake looked around the dwelling that represented everything he was being offered: knowledge, purpose, and the chance to make a difference in a conflict that could determine the future of human expansion. But it also meant giving up the certainty of his old world for something completely unknown. How long would I need to stay? Long enough to learn what you need to know, Ayana replied. Long enough to prove to my people that trust is possible. Long enough to go back to your people with the authority to speak for what you have experienced. Jake Morrison faced the biggest decision of his life, knowing that whatever he chose would change everything for everyone involved. Jake looked into the shifting patterns of light that played across Ayana's face, understanding that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the future of two entire peoples. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead he felt a strange sense of clarity. I will stay, he said finally. But I stay as myself, not as someone pretending to be what I am not. I will learn your ways, but I will not abandon who I am. Ayana nodded with what might have been approval. That is what makes it possible. We do not want you to become Apache. We want you to remain Jake Morrison while learning to walk in two worlds. What followed were 3 days that tested every skill Jake had learned in his life on the frontier. Ayana did not simply talk to him about her people's ways. She challenged him to prove that he could adapt and grow without losing the core of who he was. On the first day, she took him into the deep desert without water or modern equipment. Using only traditional tools and knowledge that she shared as they traveled, they survived on what the land provided. Jake discovered that Ayana's people had learned to read the desert like a book written in a language older than human civilization. She showed him how to find water in places that looked completely barren, following signs in the rock formations, and the behavior of insects that most people would never notice. She taught him to identify plants that could provide food and medicine, species that had adapted to this world in ways that made them more valuable than anything humans had brought from Earth. Your people look at this desert and see emptiness, Ayana explained as they rested in the shade of crystal formations that hummed with subtle energy. We learn to see abundance that reveals itself only to those who know how to look. Jake found himself amazed by the complexity of the ecosystem around them. What had appeared to be lifeless waste from his hoverbike was actually an intricate web of relationships between plants, animals, minerals, and energy sources that worked together in perfect balance. How long did it take your people to learn all this? Jake asked as he tasted fruit from a plant that looked like metal but provided sweet nutrition. 3 generations of careful observation and patient experimentation, Ayana replied. 3 generations of people willing to change their assumptions about how life should work. Your colonists want to achieve in 3 years what took us 3 generations to understand. On the second day, Ayana challenged him to understand their technology. The mechanical horses that had seemed impossible when he first saw them were revealed to be marvels of engineering that combined quantum mechanics with biological principles in ways that created tools responsive to thought and emotion. Jake learned that the machines were not simply programmed devices, but symbiotic partners that bonded with their riders on multiple levels. The technology was based on principles that blended advanced physics with intuitive understanding, creating tools that enhanced human capability instead of replacing it. Your people build machines to do work for them, Ayana explained as Jake struggled to establish a connection with one of the mechanical mounts. We build partners that work with us. The difference is more important than you might think. It took hours for Jake to achieve even basic communication with the device, and he began to understand that mastering this technology required a fundamental shift in how he thought about the relationship between humans and their tools. Instead of commanding the machine, he had to learn to cooperate with it. When he finally achieved a successful connection and felt the mechanical horse respond to his intentions rather than his commands, Jake experienced something he had never felt before. It was like having his own capabilities extended and enhanced by a partner that understood his needs better than he understood them himself. This is how you have survived here, Jake realized as he guided the mechanical mount through a series of complex maneuvers. You do not fight the environment or try to dominate it. You learn to work with everything around you as if it were alive and intelligent. Because it is, Ayana said simply. This world has its own intelligence, its own patterns and purposes. We learn to become part of those patterns instead of trying to replace them with our own. On the third day, Ayana tested something deeper than survival skills or technical knowledge. She presented Jake with scenarios that forced him to choose between personal advantage and moral principle, between loyalty to his own people and justice for others. She showed him situations where he could steal valuable technology for the colonial, settlements where he could betray information about Apache defenses that might save colonial lives, where he could abandon injured members of her tribe to save himself from danger. Each test revealed not just Jake's character, but his understanding of the larger consequences of his choices. When he refused to steal technology that could benefit his people, Ayana asked him to explain his reasoning. Because taking it would prove that your people were right not to trust outsiders, Jake said. Because it would destroy any chance of building something better between our peoples. Because some advantages are not worth the price they demand. When she offered him the chance to betray Apache defensive positions that could save colonial lives if war came, Jake again refused. Because preventing war is more important than winning it, he explained. Because trust, once broken, cannot be easily repaired. Because there has to be a way to solve this that does not require either side to destroy the other. When presented, with a scenario where saving himself would mean abandoning a wounded Apache warrior, Jake instead chose to carry the injured person to safety, even though it put him at serious risk. Because if I am asking your people to trust me, I have to prove that I will act with honor even when no one is watching, Jake said when Ayana questioned his choice. Because the kind of person who would abandon someone in need is not the kind of person who should be trusted with the future of two peoples. Each test revealed more about both Jake and Ayana. She began to see that not all colonists were driven by greed and the desire to conquer. He began to understand that her hostility toward outsiders came from generations of betrayal and broken promises that stretched back to old Earth and forward through every colonial expansion since then. On the third night, as they sat by a fire that burned with flames of blue and green thanks to minerals in the desert sand, Ayana made an offer that Jake had not expected. "Stay longer," she said, her voice carrying a weight of possibility and danger. "Not just for a few days of testing, but for long enough to truly learn what we have to teach. Long enough to become someone who can speak with authority about what is possible between our peoples." Jake looked into the strange flames, understanding that his answer would change everything. What would staying longer mean? "It would mean becoming part of our community," Ayana replied, her eyes reflecting the alien fire. "It would mean learning not just our knowledge but our ways of thinking. It would mean trusting us with your life while we learn to trust you with our secrets." Jake Morrison realized that he had reached the point where all his bridges led to the same place, a future that neither people could achieve alone. Jake stared into the blue and green flames that danced in patterns unlike anything he had ever seen on Earth or any other world. The fire seemed alive, responding to the desert winds and the mineral content of the sand in ways that created beauty from the most basic elements. It was a perfect symbol of what Ayana's people had accomplished, finding magic in what others saw as emptiness. "If I stay," Jake said slowly, "what happens to my old life? My responsibilities to the people who sent me here?" Ayana considered the question seriously, understanding that she was asking him to make a sacrifice that could not be easily undone. "Your people will assume you are dead or captured. Some will call you a traitor for staying away so long. Others will use your absence as proof that we cannot be trusted." Jake nodded, having expected as much. Frontier politics were harsh and unforgiving, especially when fear was involved. "And if I go back now, without learning what you have to teach, then nothing changes," Ayana said simply. "Your people continue to prepare for war. My people continue to defend themselves. Eventually, the shooting starts and everyone loses something precious that can never be recovered. The choice seemed impossible: stay and be branded a traitor by his own people, or leave and watch two civilizations destroy each other over misunderstanding and fear. But as Jake thought about everything he had seen and learned in just 3 days, he began to understand that the choice was not really about him. "I will stay," he decided. "Not because I want to abandon my people, but because I want to save them. If there is a chance that understanding can prevent war, then I have to take that chance." Ayanna smiled, and Jake saw relief mixed with something that might have been hope. "Then we begin tomorrow. But understand, Jake Morrison, that what I am offering you is not easy. Learning our ways requires more than just observing. It requires changing how you think about everything." Moving into Ayanna's dwelling was unlike anything Jake had experienced. The space that had seemed impressive during his visit revealed new complexities when he began to live within it. Traditional Apache symbols were not just decoration, but functional elements that controlled everything from temperature to communication systems. Ayanna showed him how to interact with the living space, teaching him to read the subtle signals that indicated the status of various systems. The dwelling responded to the presence and intentions of its occupants, adjusting conditions automatically while providing information about everything from weather patterns to the emotional state of the community. "Your people build houses to keep the world out," Ayanna explained as Jake learned to work with the environmental controls. "We build homes that connect us more deeply to the world around us. The difference shapes everything about how we live." Jake's presence in the Apache Queen's dwelling was noticed immediately by everyone in the settlement. Some watched him with curiosity, wondering what this outsider might bring to their community. Others observed him with suspicion, remembering too many broken promises and betrayals by people who looked just like him. Ayanna made it clear that Jake would have to earn acceptance from her people through his actions, not through her protection. She introduced him to the community leaders, the master crafters, the warriors, and the teachers, but she did not ask them to trust him. That would have to come from his own efforts. Jake began each day before dawn, learning the routines that kept the settlement functioning in harmony with the desert environment. He discovered that every action was planned to work with natural cycles rather than against them. Water was collected and distributed according to patterns that had been refined over decades. Energy was harvested and stored using methods that enhanced rather than disrupted the local ecosystem. The mechanical horses that had amazed him during his arrival became his daily companions as he learned to ride with the Apache patrols. Each machine was unique, with its own personality and preferences that reflected the bond it had formed with its primary rider. Jake was assigned to work with a mount called Windwalker, a device that had lost its original partner in a conflict with colonial forces. Learning to bond with Windwalker required Jake to change his fundamental assumptions about the relationship between rider and mount. The machine was not a tool to be controlled, but a partner to be understood. It responded to emotion and intention as much as physical commands, creating a connection that was part technology and part empathy. "You are trying too hard to be in charge," Ayanna observed as Jake struggled with his early training sessions. Windwalker does not want a master. He wants a friend who will work with him to achieve shared goals. It took weeks for Jake to understand what she meant. The breakthrough came when he stopped trying to control the mechanical horse, and instead focused on communicating his intentions clearly, while remaining open to the machine's own preferences and capabilities. The resulting partnership was unlike anything he had experienced with traditional technology. As Jake's skills improved, he was allowed to join longer patrols that showed him the true extent of Apache territory. The red desert that looked empty from a distance was revealed to be full of hidden settlements, resource extraction sites, and monitoring stations that kept watch over colonial movements. Jake saw how Ayanna's people had created a sustainable civilization that enhanced the desert environment instead of fighting against it. Their technology worked in harmony with natural processes, creating abundance without depletion. Their social structures balanced individual freedom with community responsibility in ways that prevented the conflicts that plagued many colonial settlements. But he also saw the preparations for war that were becoming more urgent with each passing day. Scout reports showed colonial military forces massing near Apache territory. Supply convoys were moving equipment that could only be intended for large-scale operations. Intelligence networks reported conversations among colonial leaders that spoke of final solutions to the Apache problem. "How long do we have?" Jake asked Ayanna as they reviewed the latest reports. "Weeks, perhaps less," she replied. "Your Colonel Price has convinced the territorial government that we represent an existential threat that must be eliminated before we become too strong to defeat." Jake studied the intelligence summaries, recognizing the names of officers and officials he had known before coming to Apache territory. These were not evil people, but they were frightened people who saw only one solution to a problem they did not understand. "I need to contact them," Jake said. "I need to try to explain what I have learned here." Ayanna shook her head sadly. "They will not listen to you now. You have been gone too long. They will assume you have been compromised or coerced. Anything you say will be dismissed as Apache propaganda." Jake realized that his choice to stay and learn had created an unexpected consequence. By proving his willingness to understand Apache ways, he had lost his credibility with his own people. The bridge he was trying to build had left him stranded between two worlds that were moving toward inevitable conflict. "Then what can we do?" he asked. Ayanna looked at him with an expression that mixed determination with desperate hope. "We prepare to show them something that will make them listen, whether they want to or not." Living in Ayanna's dwelling revealed layers of complexity that outsiders never suspected. The Apache Queen was not just a tribal leader, but a visionary who could see farther into the future than most people could imagine. Late at night, when the desert grew quiet except for the whisper of wind across sand, she shared her people's greatest secrets with Jake. The crystalline formations that dotted the landscape were not natural. They were remnants of an ancient civilization that had once called New Arizona home, left behind by a species that had vanished millions of years before humans ever looked at the stars. Hidden within those crystals was technology so advanced that it made human achievements look like children playing with stones. "Your people see crystals as rocks to be mined and sold," Ayanna explained as she showed Jake a communication array that could reach across galactic distances in real time. "We learned to partner with them, to understand that they are not dead matter but something closer to living technology." The implications were staggering. Jake watched as Ayanna demonstrated systems powered by crystal technology that could revolutionize everything humans thought they knew about energy, communication, and transportation. But the crystals only responded to those who approached them with respect and understanding, not exploitation and force. "This is why you have been fighting," Jake realized, as he watched her interface with crystal systems through touch and intention rather than crude mechanical controls. "You are not just defending territory. You are protecting something that could benefit everyone, but only if it is approached correctly." Ayanna nodded, her face illuminated by the soft glow of crystal displays that showed real-time information from across the galaxy. "The crystals are not just tools, they are teachers. They have been waiting for a species intelligent enough to learn from them instead of trying to dominate them." She showed him deeper into the crystal caves that lay beneath the settlement, revealing chambers that contained technology beyond human comprehension, quantum computers that could process information faster than thought, transportation systems that could move matter across vast distances without the need for ships or fuel, medical devices that could heal injuries and illnesses by working with the body's own systems rather than fighting against them. "How long have your people known about this?" Jake asked as he watched crystal formations respond to Ayanna's presence like flowers turning toward the sun. "My grandmother's generation made the first contact," Ayanna explained. "They were dying in the desert, reduced to a handful of survivors after conflicts with early colonial forces. The crystals saved them, but only after they proved they could put the needs of the whole ahead of their own immediate survival." Jake began to understand the true scope of what he was seeing. The Apache had not just survived on this world. They had been chosen by it, selected by ancient technology to serve as guardians and students of knowledge that could reshape human civilization. "Why are you showing me this?" Jake asked. "Because time is running out," Ayanna replied. "Because your people are about to make a mistake that will destroy everything we have built, and everything we could achieve together, because I believe you are someone who can help them understand what they are about to lose." The crystal chambers revealed more secrets as Jake learned to work with the ancient technology. The crystals could predict weather patterns months in advance, track the movement of resources across the planet, and monitor the health of ecosystems with precision that made human science look primitive. They could also do something far more important. They could teach. "The crystals are not just machines," Ayana explained as Jake experienced his first direct interface with the ancient technology. "They are libraries. They contain the accumulated knowledge of the species that built them, including everything they learned about how to live in harmony with the worlds they inhabited." The knowledge that flowed through the crystal interface was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Instead of simply receiving information, he was learning to think in ways that had never occurred to him. He began to understand how ecosystems functioned as single organisms, how technology could enhance natural processes instead of replacing them, and how different species could work together to achieve goals that none could accomplish alone. But the crystals also showed him something that filled him with dread. They revealed the approaching colonial military force in detail that no human technology could match. Hundreds of vehicles, thousands of soldiers, and weapons capable of destroying the entire Apache settlement in a matter of hours. "Colonel Price has convinced the territorial government that you represent an existential threat," Jake said as he studied the crystal displays showing the approaching army. "He believes you have weapons that could be used against colonial settlements." "He is not wrong," Ayana admitted. "The crystal technology could be used as weapons if we chose to do so. But we have learned from the mistakes of the species that came before us. They destroyed themselves by using their knowledge to fight wars instead of building peace." Jake realized that Ayana's people were facing an impossible choice. They could use the crystal technology to defend themselves, but doing so would prove that the colonists were right to fear them. They could try to negotiate, but the approaching military force was not coming to talk. "There has to be another way," Jake said. "Perhaps," Ayana replied, "but it would require your people to see past their fear and prejudice. It would require them to accept that there are things more important than control and conquest." She led him to the deepest chamber in the crystal caves, where the largest and most ancient formations pulsed with energy that seemed to come from the heart of the planet itself. These crystals contained the core knowledge of the vanished civilization, including the final warnings they had left for any species that might follow them. "They destroyed their own world through conflict and greed," Ayana explained as the crystals shared images of a civilization that had achieved wonders beyond imagination before turning their own technology against themselves. They left these crystals as both a gift and a warning. The knowledge they contain can lift any species to heights they never dreamed possible, but only if that species has learned to put wisdom ahead of power. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. The future of human expansion across the galaxy might depend on whether two groups of frightened people could learn to trust each other enough to step back from the edge of war. "What would it take to convince the colonial forces to stop their attack?" Jake asked. Ayana looked at him with an expression that mixed hope with desperation. "Something that would show them the true value of what they are about to destroy. Something that would make them understand that cooperation is more valuable than conquest." Jake understood what she was suggesting. They would have to reveal the crystal technology to the colonial forces, gambling that the potential benefits would outweigh the fear and greed that drove the approaching conflict. "If we show them the crystals and they try to take them by force, the technology could be destroyed forever," Jake pointed out. "Yes," Ayana agreed. "But if we do nothing, the war will begin in days and everything will be lost anyway. Sometimes the greatest risk is the only path to survival." The crisis came with the dawn of a day that started like any other. Jake was learning to interface with the crystal communication systems when alarms began sounding throughout the Apache settlement. The harmonious sounds that usually filled the valley were replaced by urgent warnings that sent people running to defensive positions. Ayana's scouts reported a massive military convoy approaching from the north, moving faster than expected and armed with enough firepower to level the entire hidden valley. Colonel Nathan Price had decided that Jake's extended absence proved the Apache were a hostile threat that needed to be eliminated before they could strike first. Jake watched the tactical displays that showed the approaching force in devastating detail. Hover tanks that could punch through any defensive barrier the Apache possessed. Combat drones that could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Artillery systems capable of reducing the settlement to rubble from miles away. This was not a force sent to negotiate or establish peaceful contact. This was an army sent to complete what Price saw as the final solution to the Apache problem. "How long do we have?" Jake asked as he studied the movement patterns shown on the crystal displays. 6 hours, perhaps less. Ayanna replied, her voice maintaining calm despite the magnitude of the approaching disaster. "They are moving faster than we expected, probably hoping to catch us unprepared." Jake felt himself caught between two worlds that seemed destined for mutual destruction. The colonists approaching the valley were his people, but they were wrong about the Apache in ways that could destroy everything both civilizations had built on this world. Ayanna's tribe had become his family, but he could not simply abandon everyone he had known before. "I have to try to stop this," Jake told Ayanna, as they watched the dust clouds that marked the military advance growing larger on the horizon. "They will not listen to you," she replied sadly. "You have been gone too long. They will assume you have been captured or brainwashed. Anything you say will be dismissed as Apache propaganda designed to protect our military capabilities." Jake understood the truth of what she was saying. In the colonial settlements, his extended absence would be seen as proof that he had either been killed or turned against his own people. Colonel Price would use Jake's situation as justification for the very attack that Jake wanted to prevent. "Maybe they will not listen to words," Jake said slowly, as an idea began to form in his mind. "But they might listen to evidence. They might listen to proof that cooperation is more valuable than conquest." Ayanna understood immediately what he was suggesting. The crystal technology that her people had carefully guarded for generations could demonstrate beyond any doubt that partnership was more beneficial than warfare. But revealing it would be an enormous gamble. If the military forces decided to seize the crystals by force, the delicate technology could be destroyed forever. "If we show them the crystals and they try to take them through violence, everything could be lost," Ayanna pointed out. "The crystals respond to intention and respect. If approached with greed or fear, they simply stop functioning. And if we do nothing, the shooting starts in a few hours and both our peoples lose everything anyway," Jake replied. "Sometimes the biggest risk is the only path that leads to survival." Ayanna looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man who had come as a stranger and become something much more important, a bridge between worlds that had forgotten how to trust each other. "If we do this, we do it together," she decided. "If we are going to risk our greatest secrets, then your people need to see that we stand as equals, not as conqueror and conquered." Jake felt a mixture of relief and terror at her decision. They were about to gamble the future of both civilizations on the hope that fear could be overcome by wonder, that greed could be displaced by wisdom. "What do we need to do?" Jake asked. "We ride out to meet them," Ayanna said with the calm determination that had made her a leader capable of uniting scattered tribes into a thriving civilization. "We show them something that will make them reconsider everything they think they know about this world, and the people who call it home." The preparation took place with the swift efficiency of people who had drilled for this possibility without hoping they would ever need to use their plans. Crystal communication devices that could project holographic displays were loaded onto mechanical horses. Portable interfaces that could demonstrate the technology's capabilities were carefully prepared for transport. Most importantly, Ayanna selected a small group of her most trusted advisors to accompany them on what might be the most important diplomatic mission in human history. Jake checked his equipment one final time, making sure he had everything he might need to bridge the gap between two groups of frightened people. His old colonial uniform, carefully maintained during his time with the Apache, would remind the approaching forces that he was one of them. His new understanding of Apache technology and culture would give him the authority to speak for what he had experienced. But most importantly, He carried the weight of responsibility for preventing a war that could destroy everything both peoples had accomplished on this world. As they prepared to ride out to meet the approaching military force, Jake realized that everything he had learned about bridge walking would be tested in the next few hours. The skills that had allowed him to move between different worlds without losing himself to either would determine whether two civilizations found a way to work together or destroyed each other in a conflict born of misunderstanding and fear. "Are you ready for this?" Ayanna asked as they mounted their mechanical horses for the ride that would determine the future of New Arizona. "No," Jake admitted honestly, "but I do not think anyone could be ready for something this important. We just have to trust that understanding is stronger than fear, and that wisdom can overcome the momentum of war." They rode out of the hidden valley together, leaving behind the safety of the settlement for the open desert where the fate of two worlds would be decided by their ability to build bridges across differences that seemed impossible to span. Jake Morrison rode across the red desert toward the approaching military convoy with Ayanna at his side, both of them mounted on mechanical horses that had become symbols of Apache adaptation and survival. Behind them came a small group of warriors, but they carried communication equipment and crystal interfaces rather than weapons. This was not a war party but a delegation, hoping to prevent the destruction of everything both peoples had built on this world. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of crimson and gold, creating a landscape that looked both beautiful and forbidding. In the distance, dust clouds marked the advance of Colonel Price's forces, moving with the relentless purpose of people convinced they were doing what was necessary to protect their civilization. Jake felt the weight of responsibility, settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Everything he had learned about building bridges between different worlds would be tested in the next few hours. The skills that had allowed him to survive on the frontier and earn respect among diverse communities would determine whether two civilizations found a way to work together or destroyed each other in a war born of fear and misunderstanding. "Remember," Ayanna said as they approached the meeting point where both forces would converge, "your Colonel Price sees everything as a military problem requiring a military solution. We have to show him something that changes how he thinks about the entire situation." Colonel Nathan Price was exactly what Jake had expected from the intelligence reports. A career military officer who had spent decades dealing with frontier conflicts through the application of superior firepower and overwhelming force. He commanded respect from his troops and fear from his enemies, but he had little experience with situations that required diplomacy or compromise. Price's face showed suspicion and anger as Jake and Ayanna approached under a flag of truce. His troops maintained defensive positions around their vehicles, weapons ready but not actively targeting the Apache delegation. Jake could see that Price was prepared for treachery, but hoped to avoid unnecessary casualties if the Apache could be convinced to surrender without a fight. "Morrison," Price snapped as they drew close enough for conversation. "You have been missing for 2 months. We assumed you were dead or captured." "I have been learning, Colonel," Jake replied calmly, trying to project confidence despite the tension that filled the air between the two groups. "Learning things that could change everything for our colonies if we are smart enough to listen." Learning or being brainwashed, Price's eyes never left Ayanna, and Jake could see the hatred and fear that drove the colonial military's approach to the Apache problem. "This woman's people have killed dozens of our people. They represent a threat that cannot be allowed to continue. Defending themselves against people who saw them as obstacles to be removed," Ayanna said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made her a leader capable of uniting scattered tribes into a thriving civilization. "We take no pleasure in conflict, Colonel Price, but we will not allow our people to be slaughtered for the crime of existing on land we have called home for 3 generations. Jake knew that he had only moments before the conversation devolved into threats and ultimatums that would make war inevitable. He had to show Price something that would change the fundamental assumptions driving the colonial approach to the Apache situation. "Colonel, what if I told you that the Apache have access to technology that could revolutionize everything we think we know about energy, communication, and space travel?" Jake said, watching Price's face for any sign that curiosity might overcome suspicion. I would say you have been listening to too many primitive superstitions and alien fairy tales, Price replied dismissively. These people live in the desert like savages. They have no technology that could threaten our forces or benefit our civilization. Jake gestured to Ayana, who activated a portable crystal interface that projected a holographic display showing real-time images from across the galaxy. The display showed star systems that were light years away from New Arizona, updated with information that had been transmitted instantaneously through crystal communication networks. Price and his officers stared at the impossible display, watching. Images from distant worlds appear and change in real time. The technology being demonstrated was beyond anything in the colonial arsenal, representing advances that could change the balance of power across human space. "This is a trick," Price said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Some kind of recorded propaganda designed to make us think you have capabilities you do not possess." Ayana smiled and adjusted the crystal interface to show the approaching colonial convoy from overhead, displaying tactical information that no human surveillance system could have gathered. The display showed the exact number of vehicles, the types of weapons they carried, and even the positions of individual soldiers within the military formation. "Your approach vector was 127 degrees from our settlement," Ayana said calmly. "You have 43 combat vehicles, including 12 hover tanks and 18 artillery platforms. Your lead scout reported mechanical problems 20 minutes ago and is currently running 15 minutes behind your main force." Price looked around at his officers, seeing confirmation in their faces that the information Ayana had provided was completely accurate. The Apache not only had surveillance capabilities that surpassed anything the colonial military possessed, but they were willing to demonstrate those capabilities instead of using them to plan an ambush. "How is this possible?" one of Price's technical officers asked, his scientific curiosity overcoming military protocol. Jake stepped forward, knowing that this was his moment to build the bridge that could save both civilizations. "The crystals that cover this planet are not natural formations. They are remnants of an ancient technology left by a species that vanished millions of years ago. The Apache have spent 3 generations learning to work with this technology, understanding that it responds to cooperation rather than domination." He gestured to the mechanical horses that his escort rode, explaining how the technology blended quantum mechanics with biological principles to create tools that enhanced human capability instead of replacing it. He showed them portable devices that could heal injuries, purify water, and generate energy without depleting natural resources. "This is not about choosing sides," Jake continued, as Price and his staff examined the crystal technology with growing amazement. "This is about recognizing that we have discovered something that could benefit all of humanity. The Apache are not our enemies. They are the key to unlocking our species' next great leap forward." The crucial moment came when one of Price's own technical specialists confirmed that the crystal technology was genuine and far beyond anything in human science. The potential applications for space exploration, planetary development, and defensive systems were enormous. "What exactly are you proposing?" Price asked, his military mind already beginning to calculate the strategic implications of what he was seeing. "A partnership," Jake said, feeling the weight of 2 civilizations resting on his words. "The Apache have agreed to share their knowledge of crystal technology in exchange for recognition of their territorial rights and participation in any development projects. Instead of conquering this land, we learn to work with it. Instead of seeing the Apache as obstacles, we recognize them as teachers." The negotiations that followed were complex and delicate, requiring both sides to overcome generations of mistrust and fear. But Jake had proven that bridge-walking was possible, that understanding could triumph over the momentum of conflict. Price agreed to withdraw his forces and recommend to the territorial government that a formal treaty be negotiated. With Ayana's people, the Apache would maintain sovereignty over the crystal sites while working with colonial scientists to unlock the technology's potential. Jake himself would serve as a permanent liaison, spending time in both worlds to ensure that cooperation continued. 6 months later, New Arizona had become the most advanced colony in human space. Crystal-powered ships could cross the galaxy in weeks rather than months. Communication networks connected distant settlements instantaneously. Energy systems powered cities without environmental damage. But the most important change was harder to measure. Two peoples who had seemed destined for war had learned to work together, creating something greater than either could achieve alone. Jake Morrison had found his true calling as a bridge walker, proving that respect and understanding could triumph over fear and prejudice. In the end, the legend that spread across the frontier was not about a white man surviving the Apache Queen's territory. It was about two peoples learning that survival was easier when you had partners instead of enemies, and that the greatest discoveries came not from conquest, but from the courage to trust across the vast spaces that seemed to divide. Different worlds,